I am at the 2023 Homebrew Con, and I've been waiting a long time to meet this guy in person, Travis Rupp, the beer archaeologist. And we've had some fun times on the interviews online.
We certainly have. We've drank a few virtually, yes. A few too many sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, I had some of your series. Gosh, what was it? There were 3 beers that you sent me.
I'm trying to remember what I would have sent you.
The
It was
Washington's
back when I was,
beer.
the Ales of Antiquity when I was with Avery.
Yeah.
So I think I sent you George Washington.
That's it.
George Washington's Porter, maybe Monticello.
It was. I had a Monticello.
And then 1752 India
That was
Pale
it?
Ale.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, what an experience. That was awesome. But here you are at Homebrew Con.
Yeah.
So what brings you to Homebrew Con?
Yeah, I've been presenting at Homebrew Con actually since 2015, since the last time it was here in San Diego. So this was kind of deja vu coming back. But I've presented every one since then except one, and that was in 2019 because my daughter was born about 2 weeks after. We weren't sure when she was coming, so didn't want to take that risk of going, to the conference. So, but I've been coming to HomebrewCon because even when I was with Avery for about 8.5, 9 years, and even in the professional realm, the beauty of HomebrewCon is the people that come here are very smart, very curious. In a lot of ways, I learn more from what they're experimenting with on a small scale than I do from like craft brewers conferences and things at times on a much larger scale.
Oh, wow. Well, that puts perspective on it.
And I think a lot of it is that the larger conferences, are very much geared towards fine-tuning new equipment and new techniques on a large scale.
Yep.
But HomebrewCon has always awarded the opportunity for a lot of experimentation. And obviously with what I do and what I've been known to do in the past, that's my curiosity and interest. So I've been tied to HomebrewCon for a really, really long time.
Well, you're writing a book.
I am.
Is that so? What can you tell us? What's going to be in the book?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm well into a book. I'd been working on a book for several years on beer in the Roman world. Mm-hmm. But I pivoted a little bit in the last year and a half, and now I'm working on a book that is more about kind of defining beer throughout history, because there's a lot of really interesting political and religious motives that have tried to define beer for its entire history. And so the book is going to do a survey starting back with the beginnings of beer. At least as of right now, we know it's 13,000 years old. Tomorrow it may be older. Who knows what we're going to find, but it's going to look...
Is it true it's the world's second oldest?
It's not. It's actually the oldest.
Oh.
Yeah. So currently, history is showing that beer is far older than wine is. According to the current archaeological record, the oldest evidence points to a cave in Israel, 11,000 BCE, or about 13,000 years ago. Wine, our oldest evidence, is 6,500 BCE, so only 8,500 years ago. Currently.
Oh, wow.
Yep. So. But that's all pretty recent too. That's a lot of new discoveries that have come out in the last, honestly, like 5 to 10 years. As science is progressing and we're able to analyze things in a different way, we're finding that it's far older than we thought it was.
So what are you going to be talking about at HomebrewCon?
I'm actually giving a lecture on, it's titled Caesar Cervicia, and it's a side project that I've been working on since 2021, I believe. It's more tied to the research I do on Roman food and alcohol, but a curiosity that I've been exploring for actually even before 2021 is, when did the Romans first come in contact with cultures that were largely dependent upon beer?
Yep.
And it's actually a really difficult thing to trace, because all of the literature from the Romans is written by the upper 1% of the population, and they're all men, of course.
Well, they were the only ones who could write.
Right, exactly. The 1%ers were the only ones that were literate.
Yep.
And that gives us a really limited scope. And so when they talk about alcohol, they typically are talking about wine. And if they come in contact with cultures or peoples that thrive on beer or experiment with beer, have new beers, they usually scoff at it as something barbaric. And so that makes it difficult to trace. Well, what I've been looking into is what I think is probably the first major contact that the Roman military had with beer as a necessity to actually get through their campaigns, and it actually seems to point to Julius Caesar. So it's a project I've been working on for a long time. I've already written up an article on it. I'm now shopping it through some academic publishers. Yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow morning. Yep.
Well, I look forward to sitting in on that one. I want to learn about that one.
Thank you.
Well, bringing things into the modern world a little bit, you've also done some work in the Reinheitsgebot, right?
Yes, I have.
Can you talk about it now?
I certainly can.
Yeah, you're pretty tight-lipped the last time we were.
I had to be pretty quiet because after I left Avery in 2020, I started my own business, the Beer Archaeologist. So now I do just exclusively research on history of beer and historic beers. And I was asked to be a witness in a federal case that came about a few years back concerning how to define hard seltzer.
That's elusive.
Yes. And it was very interesting. Worked for a legal team out of New York for about a year and a half or so.
Wow.
And representing Constellation Brands in the legal suit. Essentially what the filing was ABI. Mm-hmm. So AB InBev was suing Constellation for their rights to make Corona Hard Seltzer because they said it was a breach of contract that was drawn up in 2013 that gave them the right to produce Modelo and Corona brands as long as it was beer. Well, of course, hard seltzer wasn't a thing in 2013 when that legal agreement was drafted. They didn't want Constellation producing hard seltzer because they were trying to say that it wasn't beer.
Yeah.
And so what I was kind of pointed to do, what I was asked to do in the initial research to see if I was a good fit for this case, they asked me how I felt about hard seltzer, and I'll be completely transparent and honest on this. As a person who made a lot of it when I worked at Avery and was on the team that did all the design for that beer, I do not like hard seltzer. I don't drink it. It's not my palate. It's just not something that I go for. But it's made like about, essentially any other beer is. It's just a different fermentable sugar source. And so my opinion on the matter was that it essentially should be governed by the beer industry because of the process is the same. It's just a different fermentable. And so what I did for a year and a half was looking into, and this is where the book's coming from, how has that definition of beer throughout history changed, and why is the definition so broad, and why are things like hard seltzer, cider, those kind of things underneath the beer purview. Mm-hmm. And we actually won the case, so it went to trial. I testified in federal court in March, and the federal government decided the definition of beer would not change, that it stood since the 1860s in the Civil War, and that hard seltzer would continue to be governed by beer.
Can you tell me what that definition is without it being a long legal?
Yeah, definitely. It's mostly what it comes down to, and with Reinheitsgebot, back to your question, is that you look up what beer is online, you look up a definition of it, and it's usually going to say something along the lines of malt, water, hops, and yeast, right? And we know that those are the typical ingredients, but they're not the all-inclusive ingredients in beer. As we're going to hear at this conference, there's a talk today on fruit, right? Just fermenting fruit. I mean, there's all these different things you can do. Well, during the Civil War in the United States, they decided to broaden the definition of beer to include essentially any kind of fermentable sugar source for two reasons. One was that they wanted more beer produced for the troops on both sides of the line because they were concerned about excessive alcoholism with the consumption of whiskey during the Civil War. The other one was it would open up the doors for taxation. All of those ingredients could be taxed under beer.
That always enters into the equation.
And so that stood for that extensive period of time. The definition does talk about brewing as a requirement, so you have to heat the material to either get an extraction of sugar or to emulsify the ingredients. But then it says that typically you got to have water, you got to have yeast, and then it says malt or another accepted fermentable sugar source, and the door is wide open. And that's the way the federal government has defined it since the Civil War.
Wow.
And so that's still what stands today. And the thing that I'm quite proud of that we won the case was that I don't think a macro facility should ever define for us what we get to make as brewers, right? And that's kind of what it was coming down to. The other thing that I think ABI was very pointed at trying to do was not only run their competitor out of the market with Constellation's, Corona Hard Seltzer, but it would have impacted the entire craft beer industry as well. I mean, I have friends that own breweries where 20-25% of their income comes from their hard seltzer. You take that away, that brewery closes, right?
Yeah.
And it was trying to fight for a better cause so that our craft brewers and we as home brewers can continue to thrive and experiment the way we want to experiment.
So were there any eurekas that are, kind of, that you learned going through the Reinheitsgebot? I mean, you must have really dug into some interesting things.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. What I would say that I find the Reinheitsgebot absolutely fascinating because there are tidbits and pieces written about this thing all over the place, but not many people have done like a cohesive exploration of what really went down. And it was all, not surprisingly, politically motivated, right? And it was mostly taxation.
Yeah.
So the Reinheitsgebot came out of Gruitrecht, where there were these institutions, especially in like Belgium, France, that were taxing gruit.
Yeah.
And so the Germans said, well, let's find another ingredient or isolate certain ingredients to use for beer, and we'll skirt that tax system. Mm-hmm. Started doing it, and then the Germans said, well, wait, we want to tax that now. You're using hops.
Which is hops,
yeah,
right?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, we want to tax that now. And so what I think is probably the biggest eureka moment for me about it is we as brewers, it's such a pivotal moment in beer history, right? 1516, this law is passed, and it has really defined a lot of beer styles.
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating is the law never really stuck, even in Germany. We see it as this thing that was ingrained, right? And you go to Germany today and you expect to have your Reinheitsgebot beer. Well, it immediately, there was a huge backlash from brewers. They started moving into weird corners of Germany and brewing with different things to try to skirt the Reinheitsgebot law. And
the creativity was
exactly
brought to the surface.
Exactly. And then if it really truly was a hard and fast rule, you wouldn't have things like Hefeweizen because it's got wheat in it, not malted barley. And what eventually came about was it's better known kind of in the academia of it now as the Bavarian purity law. Because it was pretty much exclusive just to Bavaria, and in Bavaria today, it's a point of pride. So when you go there today, it's they're adhering to their regulations. But the term Reinheitsgebot wasn't even coined until the 20th century. They never called it that back in the 16th century.
So what does the word even mean? I always thought that was like, okay, this is the Reinheit.
Right. That's a great question, Doug. I'll have to look at exactly what the translation is supposed to mean. But it was a term that was literally pointed at isolating these styles in one region of Germany.
Okay.
And it was coined by a German politician in like the 19-teens or 1920s. And prior to that, it had been known as the German purity law, and then it was changed to the Bavarian purity law because about 80% of the country did not even adhere to those rules. And it's absolutely fascinating. And when you start digging into the recipes, the laws of beer in Germany's history, oh man, they were experimenting with everything we were. They were adjunct brewing. There were certain regions that said, no, we're going to put corn in our beer, or we're going to do X, Y, Z. We're going to, and no,
sugar.
Yeah, or sugar, lots of sugar. And so I think that's really fascinating. And actually, I think it's tomorrow, there's a talk being given about the lost beer styles of Germany by a German.
Yep.
And I'm very much looking forward to that talk because I think he's going to talk a lot about those styles that have been eradicated because of the popularization of the Reinheitsgebot in this kind of cultic, following of this idea, which actually was extremely oppressive to experimentation and to brewers. So yeah, it's cool to the point where, like with the book, depending on what the editor says, I might have to split the Reinheitsgebot chapter into a couple of chapters for this first round because there's so much law around it, you know. Yeah.
Well, I would have enjoyed history a lot more, I think, if there'd been a beer theme in it. but I wonder if so. You have an interesting perspective as a modern day brewer,
Right.
very experienced brewer.
Yep.
Working on what sells, which is new styles
Yep.
in general.
Yep.
Hazies.
Yep.
Yeah, Charlie Bamsworth said he spent his whole life trying to make beers that weren't hazy.
Yep.
All of a sudden
Yep.
now he was having to figure it out how to make a hazy.
Yep. Yep.
What is history? What have you learned, studying all this ancient
Yeah.
history that helps or creates, I guess, opens your imagination
Yeah.
to modern styles?
Yeah, that's a great question, Doug. I think a lot of it is that, and also being an ancient history professor and teaching archaeology and things. One thing that I always try to tell my students, and the new perspective I try to give them, at least when they walk out the door 4 months later from my class, is that the ancients weren't dumb, right? They're not stupid, backwards people, cavemen and women who are running around just foraging for food to survive. Mm-hmm. They did care about quality. They did care about technique. They were brilliant in a lot of ways we aren't because they didn't have their computer to just look something up, right? They had to constantly experiment, hands-on, figure it out for themselves.
And remember it.
And remember it, that's right. And so many, going back to beer being 13,000 years old, a lot of those traditions were just oral traditions. It was just word of mouth passed down for dozens of generations before literature even came around, literacy even came around. And so in looking at it from that perspective, I think it gives me and hopefully my students and other people who look into it an appreciation for the difficulty, right? As homebrewers, we like it's a hard job. Homebrewing's not easy. Mm-hmm. Brewing's not easy. Mm-hmm. It's very mechanical. It's very physical. And when you can relate to people that lived thousands of years ago and realize they went through the same thing, if not even more, in a more difficult situation, scenario, environment, there's an appreciation there. And I think by looking back at the hands-on component of it, it allows us to do new things. I mean, we get so wrapped up in the professional industry with how to automate everything. Hands off, AI, right? Big topic these days. And when you remove the physical aspect, I think there's something lost there, right? And going back to our ancient roots and looking at how they made the beer, we learned new techniques. They're not new, right? Hundreds, thousands of years old. But there's this huge epiphany discovery of, oh my God, they made beer like that? Or they made food, they made cheese like that? What, And there's this new appreciation.
With no refrigeration.
With no refrigeration. And I mean, like, as a brief side note on that, I teach a course on ancient food and alcohol, and I have students have to conduct experimental archaeology at the end of the class. Can choose any food they want. And this last term, I had 2 students choose cheese, Roman cheese. And they have to write like a lab report on how they went about it. And the hardest thing they had to figure out was how to smoke the cheese without just melting it. Or, and isolating it without a nice open fire pit that we all have that we can use. And those kind of having to work through those difficulties and those intricacies, I think is really, really valuable. And then the other piece of it is the ingredients, the raw materials. There's a lot of raw materials that we've completely ousted and forgotten about because of things like Reinheitsgebot or any other kind of legislation, regulations. And as I'm going to talk a little bit about in the lecture tomorrow on Caesar, when he got into Britain, the wheat there was very, very different than the wheat that he would have experienced in Italy. In particular, spelt was the cash crop of essentially the whole northern part of the UK at the time of Britannia. Well, spelt was a kind of a dead grain to the beer industry until about 5 years ago or so with the rise of hazy IPAs. Spelt creates a lot of haze. It keeps a lot of stuff in suspension, so people started brewing with it in really small amounts to create an effect. But they were brewing with it probably 95 to 100% of their grist was spelt.
Oh, wow.
And so just new interesting things in that regard, new ingredients, new fruits, new flavor additives, fermentable sugar sources, all of that comes out of looking at the past and looking at experimentation over thousands of years now.
The thing that interests me, particularly I mentioned the no refrigeration. But your, what was that IPA? Did you say 1752? Was that?
Yep.
And I remembered you describing the torture that you put that beer through.
Yeah.
And yet it was delicious.
Yeah. Yep.
And it was kind of an epiphany for me that, wow, they really did know what they were doing a long time ago. And we have all these modern techniques, but, they preach to us all the time. Oh, you got to keep the beer cold. You got to drink it fresh.
Right.
That beer was anything but those things.
That's exactly right. Yeah, 1752 was when I did the Ales of Antiquity series at Avery. It was by far the hardest one I created, and it was. I think I even told you in the interview we did. It almost reduced me to tears of all the beers that I was making, because I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to get raked over the coals for this by the powers that be at the brewery, because there's no way this is going to sell. That's what I kept thinking, because it was. Like you said, I abused that beer because I had to, put it through a scenario of temperature fluctuations, shake the barrels like they're on a boat for months. And there were points throughout that process where I'd taste the barrels and it was just god awful, but it was a part of the journey. I had to see it through to the journey, right? London to India. And I was very surprised at the very end of it that it came out. It did not taste at all like it had in those stages where I was tasting in the process, and it was good. It was,
I was shocked.
Yeah, me too. And it wasn't at all what I expected. Right.
Well, in these ancient techniques, I think Frank Bone. I spent the day with Frank.
Yep.
And I was looking at one of the bottles, and he had a Best By date of 2034. I said, Frank, am I reading that date right? He said, yeah, you are reading that date right. I said, a Best By date that's 10 years in the future? And he went on to explain, what the technique does and how it imparts, a shelf life that exceeds what we think is so modern that we have to keep cold, that you don't want any dissolved oxygen. I mean, all these things we've got to get this perfect beer. Yet that you abused the heck out of it, still produced a delicious beer.
And what's amazing about that too is I still have some of those cans in my cellar, and I'm letting them age just to see. I mean, granted, they're in a controlled environment, right? 65 degrees.
Did I get one of those out of the cellar?
You did.
I
yes,
bet
you did.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. And, I want to see how it changes too, because I think that's one of the interesting things. Like the way you described that is perfect, because it's a lot like how vintners have to think about wine, right?
Yeah.
And we, for so long, have tried to segregate and separate the alcohols. That beer is this different entity, and it should be drank right away. Now, granted, I would agree with that for a lot of beer styles, right? The fresher you can get it, the better it's going to taste. But there are certain beer styles where that's not necessarily the case, and wine is no different. There are certain wines that you should drink them while they're fresh, but there are others that are meant to be aged. And age 10 years, 20 years, and take into consideration all the oxidation and the changes it's going to go through. And I think what it does, if we were to open up our eyes and our mind a little bit more to that realization, I would hope that more of the general populace would stop scoffing at beer as this barbaric thing that us guys like to do and drink too much of. It's like there's an art to it, there's a craft, there's a refinement, and it's not that different than wine in those regards.
Well, I'm fascinated with developing beers. I'm not very good at it, so I just mostly ask questions until I really get going. Peter Buchart put me in my place. I have a lot of people putting me in my place when I ask dumb questions. And I said, I happened to ask him, we were talking about developing beers. And I said, so what is the right amount of alcohol so you can put one away in the cellar and it will cellar well? He said, there is not one. I said, oh yeah, I've heard it's 10, 11% like that. He said, wait a minute. He went in his cooler, pulled out a Berliner Weiss, poured it for me. He said, what do you think of that? I said, great, this is awesome. And he said, how old do you think it is? I said, I don't know, Peter, you're kind of pushing me here. I guess a year old, but it doesn't taste a year old. He said, what do you think the ABV is? Well, I said, well, it should be, 3.2, something like that. And he said, yeah. He says, 8 years old. And he said, you know why that low alcohol aged well? I said, no. He said, because I don't do a Berliner Weiss as a mash. He said, it's an open fermentation.
Sure.
And he said, that's the right way to do it. So
Yep.
is there a commonality? So, you know, Frank Bone ferments his, or the mash, you know, goes through open fermentation. You know, obviously Peter's
Yep.
Berliner Weiss did that. Your beer that
Yep.
you tortured
Yep.
had a lot of exposure, I'm sure.
Oh God, yes. Yeah.
So what's going on there?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, and this is, you know, very much adds to the complexity of those beers too, right? Is that there's the wild component. And as much as we like to try to control all of the parameters, when you loosen that a little bit and allow nature to do what it's going to do, I think nature takes its course, right? It kind of takes over, it creates refinements in the beer to a degree, and it's like, I mean, when a lot of the beer that I've experimented with and still am experimenting with now, you know, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands of years old, they're not going to be using closed systems. Those didn't exist. A lot of it is open fermentation. Ancient Egyptian beer, which I work on quite a bit still, completely open fermentation. And I think a lot of it is that where we want to isolate one yeast strain, one bacteria strain, depending on the environment, once they kind of get together, they start to soften things. They start to create a preservative aspect to the beer that we would normally probably overlook, just because, or we would scoff at again because we try to control, right? I mean, in the brewing world, you know, the joke that's not really a joke is that we're just, you know, paid to be janitors, right? Because that's what we are. You're constantly cleaning.
Yeah.
So all you do is clean, make sure no contaminants get in there, but is everything a contaminant, you know?
Yeah, it's almost like we create a vacuum.
We do.
That nature's just dying to
Right.
fill.
Yeah.
But if we don't do it right, it fills it with all the wrong stuff.
It does, yeah, that's right.
But if you're Frank Bone or Peter
Right,
Blucart,
right.
they know how to fill it with
Yep.
the right ones.
Well, and you've got like Cantillon, you know,
Yeah.
and you know, in Belgium, I mean, their coolship is so beautiful, you know, and you go up into the upper rafters of that building and they open the flaps at night, cool the wort, let whatever's going to fall in there, and then they put it through its process, and you know, it's world-renowned beer, right? And it's, oh my God, it's delicious, it's gorgeous. If you were to put that thing into a PCR machine to try to figure out what all's in there, though, geez, I mean, every red light on the system's going to go off, right? Half of the stuff that's in there is not even in the system to be identified, and that's the beauty of it. I think like, you know, it's kind of interesting when you look at the history of beer versus wine. I think it's so funny to me in a lot of ways that wine has become such a prestigious thing, when it's very hands-off, right? It's really mostly just letting nature do its thing. You press the juice and you let it go. Beer is far more involved, hands-on. It's very much man-woman interacting with the beer. But in a lot of ways, when we consider what's actually doing the work, though, it's still the same thing. It's the wild yeast, the bacteria in antiquity. Today, it would still be that way if we didn't control it to such a degree, right? Yeah.
Well, see, that's where I see the value in the history of beer. I mean, when you look at these modern brewers that are actually brewing things the way it was done thousands of years ago, and they have more stable products.
Yes, they do.
Than the beers that are brewed with modern technology.
Yep. I mean, even think of like Sierra Nevada. They do a lot of open fermentation on their beers and whole cone hops.
Yep.
Hardly anybody does whole cone hops anymore because of efficiency and you know, mass extraction, and you know, Sierra Nevada is not broken from their tradition, and they put out really high quality beer all the time, right? I've never had a bad pale ale from Sierra Nevada. Always the same.
But I will have to say, sanitation is unbelievable. It's like a hospital.
Yes.
And the dissolved oxygen levels are almost nothing.
Yes.
And I don't see Frank or Peter or any of these people too worried about dissolved oxygen levels. At least on his Berliner Weiss.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you know, with barrel aged products, which I made for many years, we try to control dissolved oxygen, but you really can't, like, because I mean, you're intentionally exposing it to an environment that's going to promote dissolved oxygen. And those, back to your question about how long will they age, well, those are the ones that end up in all of our collected cellars, right? And will sit for years and years and years.
Well, Yeah.
And there's dissolved oxygen in that.
Okay, so that goes back to my question where Peter put me in my place. So let's go to that exact example.
Yeah.
Barrel aging, generally are high alcohol beers. That's where I got my
Yep.
impression is it has to be high alcohol.
Yep.
So if you're going to barrel age and you want to cellar it, is there a minimum alcohol level?
That's an excellent question. I do think there is, but part of it has to do with the barrel aging itself. So if you're going to take, and I'm going to walk around your question a bit, but I'm going to come back to it. So if you're going to barrel age a beer for an extended period of time to try to get that imparted oak, whiskey, whatever flavor you want into it, tequila, you're going to be fighting nature quite a bit for it not to spoil if you don't have a higher alcohol rate. Now there's another option. You could put a higher IBU or higher hop content in the beer before it goes into barrels. As an example, we had tried to do barrel aged beers with like a triple that we had created that we wanted to sour. So we were trying to sour a triple base. The problem with it, the one we were doing at Avery, in fact, many will probably know it was Salvation. So it was our beer Salvation we had. The problem with Salvation was the IBUs were between 30 and 40, and it would not. That's enough IBU level to prohibit souring. So the bacteria wouldn't do anything. So you ended up with a pretty unpleasant finished product. It was just very blasé. A barrel-aged triple that wasn't really intended to be barrel-aged, not a good thing, right? But the alcohol was high on that. So it also was staving off bacterial growth and those kinds of things. And so if you're going to do a stout or something, if you want it to come out tasting chocolatey and that kind of stuff and maybe not having any kind of lactic acid or any of those kind of components, you're going to run a higher alcohol, and that's typically going to be 9% or higher. 8.5 maybe. But here's the tricky thing though, like we would often make barrel-aged beers that were stouts that were 12 to 15% alcohol. And then you can always, and we did this, it was one of the last beers I made before I left Avery, you trim it down with deaerated water and you can bring the alcohol content down to like 8.5, make it a bit more drinkable. It will cellar just fine, but you are blending water in to bring the alcohol content down, right? And so you can have it both ways, right? But I would say if you're going to barrel age a beer that you want cellarable, that you don't want imparted sour or malic acid or any of these kind of contents in, you're going to be running 8.5 or higher. But at the same time, maybe you want that stuff in there. I mean, as we all know, Guinness has got that unique flavor, right? We've all had Guinness. And traditionally...
And is low alcohol.
And is low alcohol.
Or at least some of them.
Yep, yeah, that's right. And traditionally with, Guinness I guess they don't do it this way anymore, but, I think it was even up until maybe the 1970s or 1980s, they were blending back in just a little bit, of their sour beer. And it gave it that interesting character, right? It gave it that wonderful finish. It looked like a big beer, but it wasn't when you drink it.
Yep.
And who's to say you can't have those things in those beer styles? Again, back to looking at our history and the way, our prior brewers have made beer, looking back on some of those things we rediscover, right? New ideas, new things.
So to develop beers successfully, it's got to have some serious hops, which Frank Bones certainly have.
Sure.
Or it's got to have some serious alcohol, 10, 11%, I guess.
Yep.
It's got to have one of those two things, or it's going to have problems. Is that kind of it?
It very well can, yes. I mean, if you're going to try to control it, and you don't want it to just go wild sour, right? Full wild fermentation souring with all these bacteria and things. Those are your two controls that, as a brewer, that we can really in a barrel environment.
Well, that's right. And I left out Peter's Berliner Weiss.
Right.
So that had the acid aspect of it.
So that's great because that's what you're going for anyway. So low alcohol is fine. And to Peter's point too, I mean, I've over the years we made a lot of sour beers I still have in my cellar. I mean, I pulled out
kettle soured or
we didn't do any kettle sours. So all barrel aged sours. I know I actually, and I'm hoping to do more kettle sours on my own moving forward. But kettle sours, some of my colleagues were terrified of the kettle souring process and the equipment and the, infecting other batches. And so we always did it post hot cider, post brew house. But I just pulled out a tequila barrel-aged sour from 2016, 2017 the other day and drank it with my wife, and we were like, oh my God, that beer now is 6 years old? It was delicious. You couldn't have even, and to your point, if somebody gave it to me blind and I hadn't known what it was, I would not have thought it was 6 years old. And it's going to be able to age another 5, maybe even 10 more years and still be good.
Well, I know you're a fantastic writer and you're a great speaker.
Thank you.
And I know you're working on a lot of research.
I am.
But I want to know, what have you not had time to research yet?
Sure.
That's a curiosity that you hope one day to have the time to work on.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question, Doug. Nobody ever asked me that. Well, like, what is it? They want to know what I'm doing, not what I want to do.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple of things. One of them, I'm actually undertaking in just a few weeks here, going to Ireland. So I've never been to Ireland before, and my family and I are going in July. And part of it is to do work for my book. So I've been researching for a long time, as you'll recall, monastic brewing, ancient monastic brewing. Yeah. And I want to find that piece of history where essentially the Christian institution that was trying to suppress beer in early Roman Christianity was completely kind of given the middle finger by their own people. Either nuns or monks that said, well, this isn't going to work where I'm at, and we are going to continue to produce beer. And we actually know that took place in Kildare in Ireland with St. Bridget of Kildare. And so I'm hoping to do more research on her. I also really want to do more research, honestly, in South America. So back many years ago, one of the early...
beer?
Yes. So one of the early ales of antiquity I did was a chicha from ancient Peru, but there's a really rich culture there that I want to explore further. I've also recently started researching Polynesian and Hawaiian history of beer and fermented alcohols. My wife is from Hawaii, so we go back there fairly often and digging into that. And then one that surprised me, and it's because because of the work I did for the legal dispute over Hard Seltzer, but also for the book that I'm working on, Defining Beer, I'd like to explore Japan a little bit more and their history in brewing and defining beer, as well as just the use of sugarcane and alcoholic beverages prior to the last 1,000 years or so, because the industrialization of sugarcane is only about 1,000 years old. Maybe even more, like most of it's like the last 500 years. And so I think there's more stuff to do there. So lots of things that I want to work on, but those are the things I really want to be digging into. And the other nice piece that I'm going to actually announce it tomorrow, but I'll announce it to you first, is that I actually have a pilot brewery now. I just purchased one. So I will be back to brewing ancient beers actually next week. I ran my water test brews before I came out here, and I will be back brewing on my own, doing my own experimentation.
Is this at home?
It is. Yeah. So
the wife let you get away with it.
She let me have it.
Wow.
The beer archaeologist, when I started the business, was going to continue to focus on education, research, public speaking. But the piece that's missing is I want people to taste the things that I'm researching. So can you tell us what
you bought?
Yes, they're here, so they'll like me repping them. I did a lot of research on it, but I've always been very, I've always really liked SS Brewtech's equipment. Yeah. And I recently did a side project for Rob Todd at Allagash on World War I brewing, and I talked to Rob, and he told me kind of, this is what we have, and I know that Vinny at Russian River uses SS for their pilot system. So I bought a pilot system, SS pilot system, to start recreating these beers, and we'll kind of see where it goes from here. Wow. Yep.
I'll have to ask Dick Cantwell what he bought, because I think he set one up himself.
Yep. And I love it. The wife did let me get away with it because we have a third bay of the garage that was not being used, and she's like, well, if you want to turn that into business space, so so that's what it is. It's got, right now I've just got, it's a small, I just did a 10-gallon system. I thought about doing a barrel, but we'll see if this grows to need a barrel. We'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Well, I want a picture.
I will send you one. Absolutely.
Or a video or something, so we can share that.
Yep.
Well, it sounds like you got some great things coming up. I hope like you always come through and promise me some things and
Yep.
come back. So
Oh,
I
most
look
certainly.
forward to hearing about Ireland. Sounds like a great
Oh
trip.
yeah, looking forward to it very
Yeah.
much so, and drinking some good beer, and I will certainly partake in the Irish whiskey too while I'm there. So
Well, that sounds
Yep.
like a great
Yes.
trip.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Travis.
my
This is
pleasure, Doug. You bet.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.